Welcome to tonight's journey. We are about to step into the world of medieval royalty, those who ruled entire kingdoms by day. Yet when night fell, they quietly wandered into strange realities that history rarely speaks of. Before the adventure begins, if you enjoy mysterious historical stories and secrets buried through time, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any future journeys. Let me know in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it for you right now? It always creates a special feeling when viewers from around the world gather in a shared moment. Now, dim the lights, let the sound of the fan and the music guide you into an ancient atmosphere, and join me until the end of this video, where the strangest mysteries of medieval royalty are waiting to be revealed. When the pages of medieval history unfold, people often see kings and queens draped in splendid robes, issuing decrees, leading armies across lands covered in morning mist. But there is another part of history that is far less told, one that official records never mention, where rulers were not only intoxicated by power, but also intoxicated in the literal sense. Because between tense court sessions and dangerous diplomatic negotiations, many rulers sought mental therapies that only the Middle Ages would dare to call medicine. If you think kings only sought power, victory, and immortality, you've forgotten an important factor. They also sought relaxation, and not the gentle mindfulness meditation of the modern era. The herbs used by royalty often had effects so strong that today they would be locked behind double security cabinets in laboratories. One of the clearest examples is the monarchs who, just stepping off the battlefield with their armor still on, would demand physicians to prepare a mind-clearing drink. It sounds noble, but in reality it was a concoction made from ingredients that even alchemists would hesitate to touch. Strange-smelling sap, suspiciously shaped roots, and sometimes powdered substances whose origins no one dared to ask about. Medieval people believed these mixtures opened the doors of wisdom. In reality, the only thing they opened was the ability to talk to walls. Among the most remarkable members of this royal club of the high and mighty were those emperors who believed that with just one special herbal tea, they could see the destiny of the kingdom. Some didn't even need to drink it. Just smelling the aroma rising from the cup was enough for them to proclaim visions, usually so vague that anyone could interpret them in 8 different ways. But that was the charm of the Middle Ages. As long as you wore the crown, anything you said could become law. And then there were kings who didn't just use herbs to relax, but treated them as tools of governance. They drank something that boosted their confidence, and in the heat of euphoria, they changed the tax laws. Another mixture made them feel guided by the divine, and immediately they launched a military expedition that wasn't in any plan. The royal advisors must have endured some of the most awkward moments in human history, half wanting to respect the king's heavenly inspiration, half wanting to stop him from signing decrees while his hands were still shaking from the side effects. There are even accounts of court meetings where the king appeared with gleaming eyes, a voice soft as wind, lecturing about the nature of the soul, the universe, or why birds fly south. The tension was so thick that the officials didn't know whether to take minutes or call a doctor to check his pulse. What's surprising is that the use of anesthetic, stimulant, or hallucinogenic substances was not considered strange at all. On the contrary, medieval physicians insisted they were remedies that balanced the body. And because the body, in medieval terms, covered everything from emotions to temperament and occasionally even politics, almost anything could be prescribed. A king in Northern Europe was once advised to take a root said to cleanse the mind. According to accounts, after a few doses, he not only felt mentally cleansed, but cleansed of his military plans and even his memory of where he had stationed his troops. This led to an emergency meeting lasting 3 days, during which the court tried to remind him of everything, while he stared intently at a candle, convinced it was communicating with him. Not to be outdone, Southern European royalty loved blends of flowers and tree resins believed to bring deep concentration. Records from that era describe the king sitting still in a room filled with incense, contemplating for hours. And just when his advisors thought he was considering an important decision, he would step out with great enthusiasm, only to announce that he had just discovered a new shape of his shadow on the wall. But the most fascinating part is that these royals truly believed they were doing the right thing. And to them, these strange experiments were ways to expand the mind, to get closer to the wisdom bestowed by the gods. In the context of their time, there was nothing to prove them wrong, and plenty of praise to encourage them to try again. All these stories are not just amusing anecdotes. They reveal a rarely mentioned side of medieval royalty. They too were frightened, lonely, under pressure, and searching for relief, sometimes in ways modern science would deem disastrous. But these moments of floating on the throne make history feel more vivid, more human, and sometimes unforgettable in the most humorous way. If the medieval world had ever hosted an award for the ruler most capable of maintaining composure while being completely unsure which dimension they were in, Eleanor of Aquitaine would certainly have won the prize for miraculously calm queen. The interesting thing is, unlike monarchs who drowned in incense or potions, Eleanor did it all with wine, but not the gentle kind you sip while listening to Baroque music. No, this was Aquitaine wine, a brew so powerful it could make a knight remove his helmet and confess his childhood traumas in under 3 minutes. And Eleanor, with the elegance of a master diplomat, used it as a soft but dangerous tool, like smearing honey on a tiger's nose. In court records, there were banquets where Eleanor sat in the grand hall, candlelight reflecting off her intricate crown, and her wine cup looked no different from a magical artifact. Knights recounted that merely seeing her raise her glass made them tighten their bootstraps, because who knew whether the night would end with a song, a debate, or a confession that would silence the entire court. Not because Eleanor was drunk, she rarely lost control, but because her wine, infused with secret herbs like mugwort, vervain, and poppy, often made everyone around her float 3 times more than she did. That was Eleanor's true strength. She understood that in a court filled with egos sharper than swords, sometimes the best way to make people cooperate was to help them relax so deeply that they couldn't remember why they were arguing in the first place. Some historians call this subtle political strategy. Others, more straightforward, call it fermented herb diplomacy. And when court poets performed, they knew they were performing for a singular audience, a woman who could punish them for mediocre verses or reward them with an entire estate, depending on the type of wine she was sipping. There's an anecdote about a young poet who recited a love poem so moving that Eleanor burst into laughter and raised her glass to order more wine for everyone. Some say the poem touched her deeply. Others whisper, softly, that the wine had been infused with freshly picked wild rose, and Eleanor was simply in the best mood imaginable. But leaving Aquitaine, we travel north to entirely different scenes where wine gave way to much stronger substances. If Eleanor was the queen of herb-infused wine, then Henry II of England, her famously hot-tempered husband, was a devotee of spirits so powerful they could wake a hibernating bear and make it question the meaning of life. In ancient accounts, Henry treated fortified alcohol like political fuel. Drink before hunting, drink before negotiating, drink before arguing, and certainly drink after arguing. If Eleanor used wine to soften hearts, Henry used liquor to soften his own resolve, before enthusiastically spilling every political plan he had. More notably, while Eleanor used wine to harmonize the court, Henry used strong drinks as a loyalty test. Legend has it that if you could remain calm after drinking the cup he poured for you, you were definitely strong enough to follow him into battle. As a result, the English court at times resembled a secret drinking championship disguised as a council meeting. History does not confirm this, but it certainly doesn't deny it, and far off in Scandinavia, the story becomes even stranger. While southern courts drowned in incense, herbal brews, and infused wine, the Viking kings approached altered states in a more practical way, through mushrooms. The infamous berserkers, warriors who entered battle with blazing eyes and godlike strength, were often said to consume hallucinogenic mushrooms. But the interesting twist is, many modern historians believe it wasn't the warriors, but the leaders who used them more often, not to fight, but to negotiate with the gods. One legend tells of a Viking chieftain sitting in a sealskin tent, chewing bright red mushrooms, then declaring he had spoken with Odin and been instructed to expand his territory. Those around him whispered that he was likely talking to the fireplace, but no one dared question him, because the moment the chieftain stepped outside, his reputation was already entwined with divine revelation. That is the effect of power mixed with mild hallucinations. Looking across Europe, an interesting truth emerges. Every culture, every court, every ruler had their own way of handling stress. For Frederick II, it was incense and herbal vapors. For Theodora, it was resin burning rituals so dense they could induce collective hallucinations. For Philip the Fair, it was churches filled with aromatic smoke stronger than modern insect repellent. For Eleanor, it was Aquitaine wine infused with dozens of mysterious herbs. For Viking kings, it was hallucinogenic mushrooms disguised as divine consultation. But beneath all the layers of incense, wine, red mushrooms, resin, and herbal tea lies a deeply human truth. Medieval rulers, no matter how powerful, also had to face fear, responsibility, and pressure. And they coped with it using methods that were dangerous, creative, and certainly not FDA approved. And it is precisely these strange, humorous moments that make history feel alive. Because when you look at great empires and world shaping decisions, you can't help but wonder, at that moment, was the king even fully sober? If Richard Fars used opium the way an officer uses marching orders, then in Germany we meet an emperor whose court looked more like an early conference on experimental chemistry. That was Emperor Frederick II, an eccentric genius known as either the Great Heretic or Europe's Wonderkind, depending on whom you asked. Frederick didn't just immerse himself in science, falconry, astronomy, philosophy, and anything else that gave popes migraines. He was also particularly fond of the consciousness expanding therapies brought by Arab physicians. In his court, the air was often thick with the scent of resin, finely ground herbs, and aromatic substances so strong they would surely be placed under strict regulation today. Chroniclers described Frederick as someone who lived in a philosophical haze. That was the polite way to say that his discussions with Muslim and Jewish scholars sometimes became so metaphysical that no one was sure whether they were still talking about law, economics, or the existence of spirits on Venus. Frederick enjoyed court laboratories where he and his team of physicians experimented with everything, from Middle Eastern sedative herbs to resins burned during prayer. Council meetings could begin seriously. Taxes, lands, war. But after a few bowls of herbal tea, the entire council would drift into analyzing the nature of time or debating whether falcons had souls. Some advisors admitted they had signed decrees in a state of such deep tranquility they no longer felt the muscles in their face. There's even a story that Frederick once held a 5-hour audience in which he and an Arab scholar passionately discussed mathematics while the entire room was filled with clouds of incense. Courtiers below sat red-eyed and dazed, trying to look like they perfectly understood the debate on non-Euclidean geometry, when in truth they were just trying to remember why they had come in the first place. Heading east into Poland and Hungary, we meet King Bela IV, who had to confront what any ruler would dread, the Mongol invasion. And like any normal human being, Bela was so stressed that the court physicians had to increase the dosage of Dienshin-supporting remedies, as the chroniclers very professionally put it. These remedies included poppy syrup, light opium flower tea, and various soothing decoctions designed to calm fear, and sometimes to mellow one's sense of time. But the fascinating part is this. While those moments left many courtiers feeling dazed, Bela himself became unusually sharp. Many of the kingdom's most important decrees, including land reforms after the war, were signed during meetings where the entire room looked like an herbal aromatherapy session. Advisors said Bela could be both trembling and insightful, both panicked and visionary. This made perfect sense. When you're running a country during a period when Europe is being crushed by an unstoppable army, anything that keeps your head from exploding is welcome. But nowhere in medieval Europe was spiritual complexity as intense as in the Italian courts. There, art, politics, intrigue, and herbal concoctions intertwined like a giant bowl of Italian pasta. Take King Charles II of Naples, famous for his erratic temperament and his habit of consuming slightly too strong sedatives prepared by monk physicians. These mixtures often included pine resin, mild opium, and herbs so relaxing that Charles sometimes smiled during war meetings, a fact that deeply alarmed his generals. An Aragonese ambassador once wrote in his diary, "The king stared at me, nodding as though he understood everything, but I am not at all sure he was listening to me or just following the sound of the wind chimes outside the window." Even so, Charles made surprisingly sound decisions. Some said that in that fragrant haze, he saw the world more clearly. Others claimed he was simply too relaxed to panic, which is exactly what made him a leader who didn't flinch. But if there were an award for most impressive use of aromatics, Emperor al-Nasir Muhammad of the Mamluks would undoubtedly win. His Cairo palace was described as a giant relaxation bath with a throne in the middle. Resins, Arab perfumes, sandalwood, amber, everything was burned in huge bronze trays that looked like belly dancers holding flaming platters. European envoys all had the same reaction: impressive, mysterious, and very strong smelling. Many left their meetings in a floating state, unsure whether it was the hot climate, the overpowering aromatics, or a deliberate Mamluk tactic to disorient them for easier negotiations. No one knew. But al Nasir did. In a room full of rich scents, people softened much more easily. The spirit supporting alchemical style reached its peak at the court of King Alfonso X of Castile, also called Alfonso the Wise. You can probably guess what happens when a king passionate about astrology, mathematics, and poetry also has access to an entire supply of Moroccan herbs. Alfonso's meetings blended astrological charts, incense smoke, and philosophical poems about the nature of time. One chronicler wrote, "The king sometimes drifted as though listening to the whispers of the stars." Modern translation, strong herbs. But it cannot be denied, Alfonso created some of the most progressive laws in Europe at the time and laid foundations for European astronomy. Meaning, if astronomy is a subject fueled by inspiration, he brought a great deal of inspiration to class. From Aquitaine to Byzantium, from London to Cairo, medieval courts shared one curious trait. Rulers who were a little bit high often governed quite effectively, perhaps because medicinal herbs soothed their fear, perhaps because aromatics boosted their confidence, or perhaps because in a world full of war, plots, disease, and chaos, anything that kept them calm, even for a few hours, was incredibly valuable. And in the end, perhaps this is the greatest lesson. Medieval kings and queens were just human, full of pain, fear, and the need to face reality in one way or another. Whether through wine, herbs, incense, or blue lotus, they were simply trying to reclaim a little peace in a world that was anything but peaceful. Perhaps the strangest and also the most fascinating case among the royals who drifted through reality comes from the cold northern lands. There, among pine forests, deep snow, and winds sharp enough to cut skin, ruled a king whose habits left medieval chroniclers scratching their heads. King Sigurd of Norway, who believed that to negotiate politics most effectively, the mind must be freed from ordinary thoughts. And for him, that liberation came from inhaling the fumes of burning juniper branches used in ancient Viking rituals. Sigurd was not the type of king who sat on his throne waiting for the gods to whisper advice. He was the kind to step into the council chamber as if entering a religious rite, wearing a fur cloak, holding a wooden bowl, and signaling the shamans to burn the resin he declared to be the key to unlocking the wisdom of war. Servants didn't dare protest. Political advisors exchanged looks that clearly said, "All right, we're having another foggy meeting today." The funny thing is that despite his intimidating appearance, Sigurd was known as the most miraculous negotiator in Scandinavia. His most important treaties were all signed after these ritual fog sessions. An English ambassador once wrote, "I do not know why the king smiled through the entire meeting, but never have I met a man easier to negotiate with." In truth, Sigurd wasn't high for fun. He did it because medieval royal life was anything but gentle. Rebellions on the borders, feuding noble families, and cold so brutal it could break any person's spirit. Sigurd simply chose a method of Viking-style mental stabilization, which in modern terms was essentially creating a portable sauna cabin made of tree resin. Meanwhile, in France, another royal chose a completely opposite path. Queen Adelaide, famous for her habit of drinking flower wine, specially prepared by monastic healers to keep her mood light as a feather. The issue was that this wine did not contain only flowers. It contained far too many things we would now classify as nervous system stimulants. Adelaide often began her mornings with a small cup, to soften the heart before facing the court. By midday, she drank a second cup to keep her words gentle when receiving envoys. And in the evening, after countless meetings, arguments, and political decisions, she drank a third cup to release the mind from the noise of the world. The result? Many foreign ambassadors described her as warm, beautiful, and seemingly always looking at you through a layer of golden sunlight. One monk wrote in his journal, "Queen Adelaide is the gentlest person I have ever met, though she often speaks to the wall." But behind the humor lies a familiar medieval truth. Royal women were often victims of political pressure, forced marriages, and impossible expectations. For Adelaide, those cups of flower wine were not for joy, they were for survival. Today, people can go to therapy, confide, or rest. She only had one option offered by the court physicians: gentleness brewed in a glass bottle. Moving to the Middle East, the medieval Islamic courts bring us to the story of Caliph Marwan, who was so obsessed with philosophical exploration that he was willing to try any method scholars claimed could expand the mind. The irony was that scholars then loved experimenting. Marwan believed firmly that philosophical visions only came to those who dared enter the dreamy realm between sleep and wakefulness. Thus, his physicians prepared concentrated rosewater, fragrant oils from eastern resins, and herbal candies said to let the spirit drift lightly like a boat on a river. The court described him as a ruler who could discuss state affairs and ponder the nature of the soul in the same morning. A careful secretary once wrote, "His Majesty sometimes speaks sentences no one understands, but then he suddenly makes a decision so wise that we must write it down at once before he forgets." This blend of wisdom and fogginess made Marwan one of the most intriguing rulers. Instead of descending into chaos, he governed surprisingly well. And the charming truth is that despite his occasional mental drifting, he still tried to balance scholarship and responsibility, something not all rulers of his era achieved. Finally, concluding this group of characters comes a gentle yet unique case. Princess Theresa of Bavaria, considered the first royal naturalist to use herbs to study animal emotions. Theresa believed many creatures possessed a secret spirit humans had yet to understand. To sense it better, she often tried herbs that heightened sensory perception. Wild mint flowers, chima roots, concentrated jasmine oil. No one in the court understood what she was doing. But her notes, full of delicate observations and emotionally rich descriptions, became valuable scientific materials in later years. In one journal entry, she wrote, "When I listen to the world with my whole heart, every living creature speaks." Fortunately, among the royals of that era, there were still those who were not consumed by politics or intrigue, but devoted their time to seeking connection with nature, even if sometimes through methods a bit dreamlike. Arminius grew up like a leaf pulled between two worlds. In Rome, he learned to behave like a gentleman, to sit upright through feasts so long you could hear time passing, to hold a dining knife as if it were not a weapon, and to understand that one wrong word could erase an entire family as delicately as Romans edited a statue. But no matter how many titles he earned, how many laurel wreaths were placed upon his head, the whispers of the forest remained in his heart. Wolves howling on winter nights, swords of his tribe clashing against shields like an unending oath. When he came of age, Arminius became a cavalry officer in the Roman army, a dream for any young man of the time, except for those who had not forgotten where they came from. He led troops to protect borders, suppress rebellions, and earned respect as someone who could wield the sword decisively while speaking with a softness that made even veteran generals nod in approval. But Rome forgot one thing. A hostage, over time, would either become a loyal ally or the enemy who knows you best. And Arminius, with everything he absorbed, military tactics, politics, the Roman mindset, the Roman confidence bordering on arrogance, began to see the cracks. He saw the arrogance of governors arriving in Germania who listened to no one, believing they could rule for us with the same laws used for paved roads. They ignored native tribes, imposed unreasonable taxes, and acted as if Germans were merely decorations on a battlefield. To Arminius, this was no longer politics, it was an insult. But he knew that to fight the strongest empire in the world, hatred was not enough. He needed the very intelligence Rome had taught him. So Arminius began playing two roles: In front of the Romans, he remained the loyal officer. In the shadows, among dim tribal villages, he whispered to chieftains, planting the seed of something that had never existed before: unity. His nights of planning were nothing like Roman political meetings. No marble pillars or three-course dinners, only flickering firelight, white breaths in the cold forest, and warriors who looked as if they had stepped out of legend. They listened as Arminius described the weaknesses of the Roman legions, how they moved, how they reacted, even the habits of specific generals. Every detail was a spark ready to fall into a barrel of powder. He did not promise glory. He did not promise victory. He only said one sentence the Germans would never forget: "If we do not rise, we will disappear." So they rose. And from here begins the story of the Battle of Teutoburg, one of the worst military disasters in Roman history, and the moment Arminius transformed from hostage into legend. Imagine the scene: three Roman legions marching into the deep forest, confident as though strolling through their own garden. Rain poured heavily, the paths turned to mud, and towering trees stood so densely they seemed ready to swallow the sky. Yet the Romans marched on, for who would fear a bunch of illiterate barbarians? Only Arminius knew they were walking into the trap he had nurtured since he was a child, taken to Rome. As the Romans advanced deeper into the forest, Arminius's tribesmen emerged from the mist like ghosts given form. No Roman formation could withstand a place where every tree was a wall, every root a trap, and every step pulled them deeper into their own mistake. The ambush lasted for days, so brutal that Roman historians reportedly paused their writing just to breathe. When the news reached Rome, Emperor Augustus cried out in despair, "Quintilius Varus, give me back my legions." But the three legions had vanished into the Teutoburg forest, as if swallowed by the earth itself. Arminius didn't just defeat Rome, he tore off the mask of invincibility they had worn for centuries. But victory did not bring peace. Without a common enemy, the tribes fractured, doubted, and feared the man who understood too well how to unite them. Arminius, once their liberator, became a threat, and so one evening, his own kin, those who once called him brother, turned against him. Not because they distrusted him, but because the power he held, though he never sought it, frightened them. Arminius did not die by Roman hands, but by those he saved. A tragic and cruel ending, like every story that lies on the border between civilization and wilderness. Yet his legacy did not fade with the blades of betrayal. Arminius became a symbol of freedom, of unyielding spirit, of a man who dared to challenge the greatest empire in human history using the lessons that empire had taught him. He became the embodiment of a beautiful paradox. Sometimes the captive is the one who best understands how to break the chains. Arminius's conviction radiated a strange weight, as if he were carrying a map of the future that only he could see. The older chieftains, long accustomed to arguing with each other more than with the Romans, now fell silent when he spoke, not because they feared him, but because they realized they had never faced a man who understood the enemy so completely. Arminius was not just a warrior, he was a strategic machine forged by the very empire they despised. The early secret meetings were merely small exchanges, a few people, a few whispers beneath low wooden roofs. But then the flame spread. From the Gerani to the Marsi, from the Chatti to the Brooki, each leader returned to his tribe with eyes lit up, a light Rome had not seen in years. Not a vague hope, but a hope with shape, with a path, with a strategy. A hope drawn not from promises, but from knowledge. Arminius emphasized that victory would not come from the brute strength Rome mocked in the tribes, but from using Rome's own principles against them. Rome lives on order, he said. Take order from them, and all that remains are men trapped in heavy armor, suffocating in a forest they cannot breathe in. That was when the chieftains understood one thing. If they fought like Rome, they would die. But if they fought like the forest, they had a chance. And for the first time in generations, they sat together not to boast of battle scars or strong drink, but to listen to Arminius dissect every weakness as if he were performing surgery on a slumbering giant beast. Meanwhile, Varus was still drifting in illusions of power. To him, Arminius's timely appearance, polite, refined, knowledgeable in both worlds, was a gift from the gods. He did not understand that Arminius was silent not out of respect, but out of observation. The flattery Arminius offered him was sweet honey, that enchanted Varus, while the German chieftains looked at him like a man playing with fire without realizing he was standing in a forest dripping with resin. Varus failed to see the truth. Arminius knew every move, every plan, every supply line he had. A Roman governor at his most confident was also the most predictable. Every military meeting Arminius attended, he noted every furrowed brow of Varus, every excessive assertion, every delusion that Germania only needed proper management. With each such detail, the final pieces of the plan clicked into place. But Arminius was not only fighting Rome, he was also fighting skeptical Germans. Many warriors still saw him as someone Romanized, a man they feared would feed rebellion plans back to the empire. They looked at him with a mix of respect and suspicion, as though facing a wolf raised inside a human pen. But through each conversation, each drawn-out strategy, each coldly precise military detail he recalled, they realized no one else could do this. It wasn't that they trusted him, they trusted that he was their only chance. Arminius knew those doubts needed to be erased by action, not words. So he began orchestrating small rebellions, cleverly staged to test Roman responses. Small groups of warriors attacked outposts, cut signal lines, destroyed stretches of roads the Romans had just built. Nothing too serious, just enough for Varus to think these were reckless acts by a few disgruntled barbarians. But for the tribes, it was proof that Arminius truly stood with them. Each successful strike boosted their confidence. Each group returning safely eased their fears. And every small Roman miscalculation strengthened what Arminius had predicted all along. Varus would underestimate them until the final moment. And then the inevitable happened. A rebellion, meticulously staged, large enough to force Varus to intervene. The tribes in the eastern region suddenly rose up, compelling Varus to mobilize his full force. 3 legions, tens of thousands of elite Roman soldiers, were ordered to march into the forest to quell the unrest. Arminius stood beside Varus, clad in Roman armor, his hand resting on the metal sword given to him by the empire, smiling at the governor's praise, while inside him the tension thrummed like a bowstring ready to release. He knew. The moment history would remember was approaching. He had summoned the storm, and now he would lead his enemy into its center. As the legions began their march, Arminius turned his back on the Roman camp. No one realized that from that very second, he was no longer an officer of Rome. He had returned to being a son of the forest, heir to the blood of the Girani, and the leader who had waited his whole life to say the words history would echo forever, "It has begun." The first night passed as if even time itself was afraid to step through the shadow-drowned trees. The Romans huddled beneath their drenched shields, the campfires flickering like the dying eyes of men who knew fortune had abandoned them. Every rustle in the forest made them flinch. Every distant laugh scraped across their nerves like claws. The silence of the enemy was more terrifying than a battle cry. The Romans sensed that the Germanic warriors were not sleeping. They were watching, waiting, and savoring every moment of the legion's growing despair. At dawn, when the mist had not yet lifted, Arminius returned to the battlefield, not as a Roman officer, but as the leader of those surrounding it. His new cloak, woven from dark animal hide, billowed in the wind like the symbol of a betrayal now complete. But to his warriors, it was not betrayal. It was a homecoming, a call of blood, the moment their ancestors had long awaited. From atop his black war horse, Arminius surveyed the Romans' makeshift camp, a pale wound in the forest. Hastily built fences leaned crookedly, puddles settled in the marks of soldiers' boots. Bodies lay unburied because no one had the strength left to bury them. He knew they were beginning to collapse, not from casualties. Those were nothing compared to other battles, but their spirit had shattered. They were forced to fight in a world they didn't understand, against an enemy they couldn't see. Arminius gripped his long spear and raised it high for his fighters to see. He didn't need to shout, didn't need to urge. A single sweep of his arm was enough for the warriors hidden in the trees to understand what was coming. The second day's battle began not with a scream, but with the disappearance of light. Black clouds rolled in from the north, pulling the sky down with them. Another storm was coming. For Rome, it was a disaster. For Germania, it was a gift from the gods. As the rain began to fall, spears and javelins rained down from above once more. But this time, they were followed by waves of sudden, unannounced charges. Germanic warriors burst from the undergrowth like spirits of the deep woods, weapons swinging with ferocious roars. They didn't try to seize ground or form ranks. They aimed at only one thing: the stability of the legions. Varus attempted to counterattack, ordering more barricades, more stakes, tighter formation. But every command came too late. The terrain smothered their movements. At the widest points, they could form only two ranks. At the narrowest, each soldier passed through like squeezing between cracks in stone. The heavy Roman infantry, once the backbone of the empire, had become its own burden. The Germanic fighters knew it and targeted that weakness with precision. While the Romans scrambled to restore order, Arminius urged his horse to the front line. He did not stand behind like a Roman commander. He fought beside his men, striking with a strength he had hidden for years beneath Roman armor. That sight, a Germanic prince, once granted Roman titles, now leading a rebellion, ignited his warriors' spirits like oil thrown into fire. For the Romans, it crushed their morale beyond repair. Rumors spread like plague. Arminius had betrayed them. The man they trusted most, the man with Roman rank, the one who had sat beside Varus for months, was now killing them with the very strategies they thought he served. Some officers tried to deny it, calling it fear. But then they saw him clearly among the trees, and their world fell apart. Not just because he betrayed them, but because they realized Arminius had planned everything from the beginning. They were not losing to a stronger enemy. They were losing to an enemy who understood them better than they understood themselves. By afternoon, when the rain eased, the Roman camp was nothing but a ruin of mud, blood, and shattered shields. A dazed Varus still tried to maintain order. He ordered a retreat westward. A narrow gap in the forest, the only one, could lead them out of the encirclement. But even that path was just the final trap Arminius had left, like a strand leading prey deeper into a spider's web. As the Romans attempted to flee the camp, they were attacked again, this time with greater fury, greater cruelty. These were no longer strikes meant to weaken. This was slaughter. The Germanic warriors no longer hid in the dark. They charged straight into the Roman ranks, each blow fueled by years of oppression. And in the chaos, Arminius saw what he had been waiting for: the total collapse of the legions. No more formation, no more discipline, no more belief. The second day ended not with trumpets of retreat, but with cries echoing through the forest. The cries of the last Romans realizing they were not fighting to win. They were fighting not to die. But Arminius knew, tomorrow, even that choice would be gone. The northern wind blew sharp as a blade, lashing against the groups of people being driven toward the border. They did not walk like soldiers marching to war, but like souls dragged out of the living world to serve a sentence that would never be read aloud. Along the red dirt roads, chains linked them in long, heavy lines stretching across desolate valleys and cold gray ridges. Every step they took pressed not only into the earth, but onto the last hope they still carried. Ahead of them lay the worksite, where the emperor's promise became reality through blood, sweat, and lives. Labor camps rose like ghosts in the wilderness. There were no dignified walls, no properly built barracks, only makeshift huts propped up with wooden stakes, roofs covered with animal hides stiffened by snow. When the convoy arrived, they saw gaunt figures hauling stone, digging earth, carrying timber, people who had been working here for months, even years. Their faces were ashen, their eyes sunken, and no light of resistance remained. Their bodies seemed to blend into the mountains themselves, sustained only by exhaustion. The overseers and imperial soldiers made no attempt to hide their cold indifference. They read out lists, handed out shovels and picks, and ordered work to begin immediately, whether it was morning, noon, or a snowy midnight. To them, each person in the forced labor ranks was not a human being, but a unit of productivity, expendable, replaceable, and within the vast empire, replacements were always available. But the true cruelty of the borderlands came not from strict discipline, but from nature itself. Here the ground was the enemy. It was as hard as iron, especially in winter, when every swing of the pickaxe bounced back into the workers' arms like mockery. Summer brought a different torment. The sun baked the earth into a furnace, and the wind carried sand that lashed at their faces like swarms of venomous insects. Some days, dozens collapsed from heat or cold, but the work never stopped. Their bodies were dragged aside, covered with a thin layer of dirt, and the person next to them was immediately pulled into the empty spot. The wall slowly took shape, stone by stone, step by step, hammer blow by hammer blow. But none of the people hauling rocks and mixing earth believed it was the wall of the nation. To them, it was a colossal tomb, one they were building around themselves. Yet amid the harshness, there were stories the court would never know. The forced laborers, torn from their homelands and families, found ways to hold on to the last fragments of their humanity. When night fell and small fires flickered to life, they shared tales of home. One spoke of rice fields ripening under the sun, another of a son who had just learned to walk, another of the warm soup his wife always cooked for him in winter. In the brutality of their world, those small memories were the final thread tying them to the lives they had lost. But dawn came again, and with it, the sound of the command drums. Humanity had to give way to duty, a duty imposed by an emperor they would never meet. Among the thousands brought to the border were some who had once carried swords into battle, who had once fought beneath the imperial banner. Now they pushed stone carts like slaves. They understood better than anyone what the wall represented: the fear of an empire, the fear that northern horsemen might cross the border at any moment, burning villages before the imperial troops could arrive. And when people are afraid, power often chooses the harshest solutions. Gradually, the wall became more than a construction. It became an invisible boundary dividing the empire. On one side stood the emperor and his officials who believed they were building eternity. On the other were those who paid for it with their lives. To them, the wall was not pride. It was a reminder of their helplessness before absolute power. Even as the construction advanced, rumors of northern enemies arrived daily. Horsemen lurking behind ridges, surprise raids on small outposts, patrols disappearing without a trace. The wall was far from complete, but war already stood beyond it. That only made the emperor more fanatical about the project. He no longer saw the wall as a defensive structure, but as his personal masterpiece, a monument that immortalized his power. And so the pressure grew. Work had to double, speed had to double, lives became worth half as much. The work sites saw people dying of exhaustion every day. Some nights, snow buried dozens alive. Some mornings, northern horsemen attacked at dawn, leaving laborers and guards alike unable to tell where the battle line was. The dead were not recorded. The survivors were not allowed to rest. Yet within that utter despair, another fire began to flicker, a quiet awakening. The laborers, victims of the imperial court, began sharing a new belief among themselves: that the wall would never belong to the emperor, but to those who bled to build it. That history would remember them, even if the court tried to bury their names in dust. And so, amid the cold, the screams, the senseless beatings, one idea grew steadily clearer. This wall was not a symbol of the empire's strength, but proof of its fear. And the people building it, one by one, were the silent rebellion against that fear. When the first sections of the wall rose like the stone vertebrae of a colossal beast, the madness of the construction began spreading like a plague. No one knew exactly how many had died in the first few months. The overseers recorded no names, only the number of broken shovels, picks, and wicker baskets. Those who went missing simply vanished into the stone, the sand, and the ice, as if the land itself had swallowed them without leaving a trace. Yet the harshness of the frontier had not reached its final limit. One winter afternoon, when the sky turned a thick shade of iron purple, a sudden blizzard crashed down upon the worksite. Even though the soldiers were accustomed to foul weather, this storm felt like an evil spirit unleashed from the north. The wind tore through the flimsy camps, toppled scaffolding, and ripped away the protective cloths so violently that many believed the entire wall was about to be uprooted. Workers collapsed, clinging to stones so they wouldn't be blown away. But the most terrifying thing was not the snow. It was the order from the overseer: continue working. The laborers stared at one another, unable to believe their ears. But when the whips cracked through the white storm, they understood that the blizzard was no excuse to stop. Nothing was an excuse to stop. Many died standing in the storm, still clutching their wooden hammers. The next morning, they were dug out from the snow and placed aside like rotting logs. The survivors returned to work, eyes swollen, hands bleeding, but none dared to pause. Such relentless deaths gave rise to a new fear within the camp, the fear of being forgotten. Some whispered that the spirits of the dead could not leave, for there were no rites, no one to call their names one last time. At night, some guards swore they heard faint tapping on the stones, as if the buried souls were trying to climb back to the surface for one final glimpse of the sky. These rumors were brutally suppressed by the overseers, yet they spread like steam from a bowl of hot soup on a winter night, impossible to contain. Still, not all fears were invisible. One noon, as the sun stood directly overhead, the sky trembled with hoofbeats. The northern riders had returned. This time they came not to scout or intimidate. They came to kill. From atop the hills, arrows rained down like a black storm. Laborers scattered, torn between two forces, the true enemy and the overseers shouting with whips raised high. Anyone who leaves their post will be executed. Some desperate men hurled stones at the enemy as if fistfuls of dirt could stop steel blades. Others dove into makeshift burrows. Many fell, trampled in the chaos. The Thiangu, swift as shadows, needed only minutes to inflict damage that would take the workers months to repair. When they withdrew, something far more chilling remained. On the corpses left behind, there were no signs of looting or plunder. The Thiangu wanted nothing. They left only a message: fear. And so war became woven into daily life, ready to erupt at any moment. This constant chaos led many laborers to a bitter realization. The enemy outside was terrifying, yes, but they still had humanity. The imperial court did not. The attacks grew more frequent. Sometimes Qin soldiers captured a few northern prisoners, but the information they provided only deepened the dread. The wall was creating more enemies than it was pacifying. In the distance, the nomadic tribes were beginning to gather, not to invade, but to witness the madness of the Southern Empire. Yet the emperor saw the opposite. To him, all the chaos, the deaths, the fear proved only one thing. The wall needed to be built faster, longer, stronger. New decrees were issued. More manpower was demanded. The fertile southern lands began to empty of men, for all were being driven to the north. Soldiers no longer marched to war, they marched to build. Farmers no longer tilled their fields, they withered from exhaustion. But just when everything seemed at its worst, something else began to form, something never included in the emperor's grand vision: human compassion. People from different regions began to see each other as brothers. They shared every grain of millet, every bowl of water. They dug graves for the dead with a respect the court never offered. They began to remember each other's names, something the officials deliberately ignored. At night, they gathered in circles, singing old songs from their homelands, not to console one another, but to prove they were still alive. And from that unity, a dangerous thought emerged. If they could build such a colossal wall, then they could also tear it down. The idea was never spoken aloud, but it lived in every exhausted glance, every trembling hand, every breath in the winter darkness. Because the wall did not merely imprison the northern enemies, it imprisoned the very people who built it. More and more, it became clear that what was being constructed was not just a defensive structure, it was the foundation of a nameless uprising. When the death of Qin Shi Huang had not yet spread beyond the palace corridors, out on the frontier, the news fell like a small stone onto a frozen lake, creating no sound, yet cracking the entire surface beneath. Soldiers, laborers, exiles, all felt a shift in the air, though none dared to speak it aloud. During the first nights after the bad news reached the camp, the wind that swept through the watchtower sounded like the sigh of the heavens. The soldiers still kept guard, the workers still stacked stones, but no one believed anymore that they were building for some grand ideal. Some whispered that even in death, the emperor's shadow still lingered on the wall like a hungry ghost. Others simply looked at their calloused hands and understood that whether the emperor lived or died, they remained trapped in this stone mill. The change came slowly, beginning with a glance. The soldiers who once watched over the workers now looked at them differently, not like prisoners, but like men who shared the same fate. At the same time, the workers observed the soldiers, whom they had once seen only as the extended arm of the court. But now, every soldier looked pale, sleepless, drained. They were no different from one another. All were drying up like water in a well during drought. And so, Something the court had long tried to suppress began to rise, the unity of the downtrodden. At night, small groups gathered beside dying fires, far from the overseer's sight. They did not speak of politics or rebellion, not openly. They spoke of their homelands, of harvests missed, of fathers, wives, and children who would never hear news of them again. And from these stories, a silent realization took shape. It was not the northern enemies who were killing them, but the empire they served. In the barracks, a new fear spread like wildfire, the fear of their own hands. Many soldiers realized they had helped drive the workers to death. They had wielded whips against men as miserable as themselves, all because of a decree signed by someone so distant that they had never even seen his face. Some young soldiers lay awake at night, wondering whether the wall was truly meant to protect their homeland or merely to serve the immortality of a king. Once doubt was planted in the heart of a soldier, it became the most dangerous seed. Then the opportunity came, not from people, but from the heavens. One night, a storm erupted. The wind howled so violently that bamboo scaffolds were flung away like straw. Workers' tents were torn apart, soldiers' posts toppled. Groups of people clung to the stone wall like clutching their last hope against being swept away. Lightning tore the sky, illuminating desperate faces reflected on cold stone slabs. Amid the chaos, a shout rose from the west side of the camp. "The wall collapsed! Help! Someone's buried alive!" Soldiers rushed over on instinct, but no longer distinguished worker from soldier. They dug with their hands, with daggers, with anything they could grab. There were no orders, no ranks, only human beings trying to save each other from a death that was swallowing them whole. That night, many died. But that same night, something else was born. The belief that they could survive if they relied on each other, not on the court. After the storm, the worksite was in such disarray that the overseers could no longer enforce discipline. Materials were washed away. Sections of the wall cracked open, supply carts overturned in the valley. Everything collapsed in a single night, like heaven's punishment upon the emperor's arrogance. Yet the most unexpected thing was this: workers and soldiers were no longer afraid of one another. When the order to rebuild was issued, many soldiers obeyed only reluctantly. They performed their duties, but their hearts no longer belonged to the court. Some helped workers find food, hidden in crevices between stones. Some pretended to record the names of the dead, then secretly allowed others to escape. From these small acts, an underground network formed, leaderless, planless, bound only by a shared thought. This wall is not a shield, it is a chain. And if a chain can be forged, it can also be broken. From then on, the conversations under the moonlight were no longer just tales of home. They became faint whispers of a distant day, when they would no longer serve the emperor's shadow, when the roads they built would lead them home instead of leading them to death. In their hearts, they knew that day was far away. But in a world where hope was as rare as spring water in the dry season, even a single spark was enough to reignite the spirits of those thought to be drained of their souls. And so, beneath the colossal wall, built to divide people from people, something the court could never predict was forming: the unity of the oppressed, a unity that needed no flags, no slogans, only one thing: the belief that shared suffering could become shared strength. The wall continued to grow, but so did the fire within those who built it. When the early sun rose behind the hills of Olympia, casting a golden glow over every olive branch and every bowed head before the altar of Zeus, people understood that the most sacred moment had arrived. The air was eerily still. Even the birds seemed hesitant before a ritual greater than their own existence. And in that moment, all of Greece seemed to hold its breath, awaiting the beginning of a grand festival they believed would shape the destiny of both mortals and gods. The athletes, after months of crossing mountains and passes, now stood in long rows before the stone steps. They carried not only the strength of their muscles, but also the pride of their home city-states. Each one was a living symbol, a vow walking on the lifeblood of their families, on the expectations of generations. The sweat flowing down their shoulders was not only from the heat, but also from a mix of excitement and fear. Not the fear of failure, but the fear of being unworthy under the eyes of Zeus. The priests stepped forward, their white robes brushing the ground, every movement careful as if performing the ritual before the direct presence of the gods. They led the procession to the sacred ash altar, just a small mound, yet containing centuries of offerings turned to dust. A young athlete from Elas was chosen to carry an olive wreath that had been washed in the holy waters of the Cladius River. He walked slowly, his chest rising and falling with each step, as if he bore the weight of all tradition within him. The wreath was placed on the altar, and thick smoke rose, swirling like invisible ribbons. The moment the sacred flame was lit, the cheers of thousands erupted. Not the frenzy of the battlefield, but reverence. A trembling sensation swept through the crowd as they gazed at the flame believed to guide every contest, every victory, and every defeat. From that moment, no one was an outsider. They were connected by that flame, a flame passed down through generations, from a time when myth and history had not yet parted. However, the ritual was only the beginning. Outside the stadium, tents, stalls, and craft booths had been set up. The atmosphere became bustling, like a city rising overnight. Traveling performers played songs praising heroes. Poets gathered under large trees reciting improvised verses about bravery, sacrifice, and the pride of warriors. Fortune tellers from Delphi, Thebes, and Megara sat on thick rugs, ready to interpret the omens they believed Zeus sent through the incense smoke. Yet amidst the liveliness, the athletes remained separate. They slept in special quarters under the strict supervision of their trainers. Every meal was carefully calculated, every breath steady. They knew one small mistake could cost their city-state its pride. But what terrified them most was not their opponents. It was the oath they would soon recite before the altar of Zeus. The next morning, as sunlight flooded every corner of Olympia, the athletes approached the altar on bare feet. They raised their right hands and swore to compete with honor, without cheating, without tricks, and with absolute respect for the gods. The sound of the oath echoed like stones dropping into a still lake, sending ripples far and wide. When the last word was spoken, every gaze turned toward the stadium, where contests believed to be watched by Zeus himself would unfold. Before entering the first match, there was a ritual unknown to many modern people, the anointing of the body with oil. Olive oil was stored in ceramic jars decorated with images of the gods, where each athlete's trainer rubbed the oil onto their shoulders, backs, arms, and legs as a silent prayer. They believed the oil helped the body stay supple, but more importantly, it symbolized purification. And then the bronze trumpet sounded, the signal that the festival had officially begun. Inside the arena, the athletes stepped out one by one to thunderous applause. The air was so thick with energy that one could feel the passion vibrating through every heartbeat. The runners stood barefoot on the sand, eyes fixed straight ahead like arrows waiting to be released from the bow. Wrestlers dusted themselves with fine powder to increase their grip. Each one felt that a single twist could make them a legend or erase them into oblivion. Even the kings and generals of Greece, when they came to Olympia, were stripped of their power. They had to sit among commoners under the same sun as everyone else. They could not command or threaten. Here, only one being had the right to judge, Zeus. And it was in this absolute equality that the ancient Olympic Games achieved greatness. Not because of victory, but because of the desire for perfection. Not because of power, but because of reverence. Not because of hatred, but because of the belief that no matter how divided Greece was, this place, Olympia, could unite them as one people, if only for a single moment. Pancration, the event the Greeks considered the ultimate measure of strength, was where the limits of human ability were pushed to their absolute edge. When two athletes stepped into the circle on the sand, the crowd immediately descended into a tense silence. There were no gloves, no strict rules, only a few basic prohibitions. No eye gouging, no biting. Everything else was permitted. The Greeks believed that pancration was not merely a fight, it was a ritual, a final proof of courage, of the quality required to stand before Zeus without trembling. When the two fighters locked onto each other with muscular arms, the only sounds beneath the sunlight were their labored breaths, the crushing of sand underfoot, and at times the crack of bones colliding so sharply that the audience shuddered. Every movement unfolded both swiftly and brutally, as if the two warriors were not just seeking victory, but racing to carve their names into immortality. Pancration champions often became legends, their names etched into marble, preserved in the memory of generations as those who had reached the sacred boundary the Greeks called arete, absolute excellence. But the ancient Olympic Games did not honor human strength solely through hand-to-hand duels. One of the events that made all of Olympia hold its breath was chariot racing, a fusion of speed, skill, and fortune. On the oval track, lightweight two-wheeled chariots were pulled by 2 or 4 war horses, their manes flying, their hooves striking the ground in a thunderous rhythm. The chariots sped forward at breathtaking velocity, only a few handspans apart, wheels clashing, wood splintering, and with just a slight pull of the reins, everything could collapse into chaos. Chariot racing was not only dangerous, it was a display of aristocratic power. Victory did not belong to the charioteer, but to the person who financed and raised the horses. At times, the one who received the olive wreath wasn't even present in the stadium. They simply sent their team to compete. Yet to the Greeks, this did not diminish the glory. For chariot racing was not just the strength of one man's hands, but the strength of an entire lineage, of wealth, and of influence. Outside the stadium, the sanctuary of Olympia breathed to a different rhythm. As the contests took place, the sacred grounds were filled with pilgrims, merchants, poets, and philosophers. In the vendor stalls, sellers offered pottery, figurines, and souvenirs depicting gods, heroes, and past champions. Every item carried a fragment of a story, a legendary sprint, a wrestling throw that stunned the stadium, or a victory that spared a city-state from disgrace. Philosophers came not only to watch the contests, they argued beneath olive trees, debating the meaning of victory, the nature of fame, and the relationship between humans and gods. Many of these discussions later inspired philosophical schools that endured for centuries. And the traveling poets, they were the journalists of their age. They recorded every triumph in song, then performed it before the crowd, ensuring each athlete would be remembered not only for their strength, but through music, story, and the pride of those who heard them. But the most extraordinary moment, the element that made the Olympic Games a defining symbol of Greek civilization, was the proclamation of ekeischeria, the sacred truce. During the Games, all Greek city-states were required to cease warfare. Longtime enemies, Sparta, Athens, Corinth, laid down their weapons. They crossed each other's territories without fear of death. This was the only rule in the ancient world universally respected by every Greek polis. During those 5 sacred days, the entire Greek world seemed to hold its breath. No bloodshed, no weapons, only humans facing one another with strength, courage, and the glory they earned for themselves. To the Greeks, this was peace in its noblest form. When the contests ended, the victors were crowned with olive wreaths from the sacred tree grown in Zeus's own grove. There was no prize money, no gold or silver, only a wreath of leaves. Yet its value surpassed all treasures, for it proved that its bearer had been witnessed and approved by Zeus. When a champion returned home, the entire city-state poured into the streets to welcome them. The city gates were thrown wide open. Sometimes even the walls were dismantled to create an entrance, a symbol that the athlete had surpassed limits set even by the gods. Victors received free meals for life, statues in their honor, poems celebrating their feats. They became living symbols of pride, proof of what the Greeks believed most deeply, that greatness could be forged by human hands. And that was what lifted the ancient Olympic Games beyond the bounds of a mere festival. It became a sacred ritual, a place where human beings prove their worth not only to each other, but to the gods themselves.